Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I've come all the way from Boston, US to participate in this workshop. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you for being so engaged and willing to have this conversation with us. I think the speakers before me have highlighted already so nicely why this is such a critical topic for us, the intersections between climate change, agriculture, and inequality. And I'll just say a little bit more about the project framing and how it aligns with what has already been said and how that's shaped where we're going forward. So I think we already know that climate and development challenges are becoming increasingly intertwined. For example, the IPCC 1.5 report highlighted that limiting global warming to 1.5 rather than 2 degrees would make it much easier to achieve many aspects of sustainable development and would make it much easier to eradicate poverty and reduce inequalities. This was reiterated in the latest IPCC AR6 Working Group 2 report, which also highlighted the need for climate resilient development and development pathways that really account for climate change and inequality as well. On the flip side, we have the Sustainable Development Goals reports, which also highlight the interdependencies and interlinkages between different dimensions of sustainability, including health, well-being, social and economic prosperity, and climate and ecosystems, and really emphasize the need for a transformative approach, which really takes into account all of these different dimensions of development alongside climate and inequality. We also know that the need to address inequality has never been more critical. Coming out of COVID, we've seen that the poorest and most vulnerable have been the most affected. And we also know that climate change and inequality are becoming increasingly intertwined in that climate impacts will affect the most vulnerable, will affect the poorest. But at the same time, even climate solutions could negatively affect the most vulnerable as well, right? If they do not take into account inequalities, if they do not take into account the needs of vulnerable groups, then the ways that we implement climate solutions could also increase inequality if there's not a just and equitable transition taking place. And we also know on the flip side that inequality itself is very much a driver of climate change as well, because it is really the richest that are contributing the most to climate change. So I see these two issues as very much intertwined. We know that global commitments have been made, and the speakers before me highlighted the importance of the Paris Agreement and on the one hand, and then the Sustainable Development Goals on the other hand, which have been agreed through global processes and are now being implemented nationally through national plans and policies and are periodically reviewed. However, we have seen even at the global level that these processes are very siloed. So we have, the COPs, the annual conferences of the parties, where climate goals are discussed, and then you have the HLPF, the High Level Political Forum, which discusses the Sustainable Development Goals. These two processes are kept separate. At the global level, at the national level, you often have separate ministries or departments in charge of climate change versus development, for example. And so what we're really interested in thinking about is the interconnections between them and how can we design policies that account for both climate goals and sustainable development goals. We also know that progress on both of these agendas is still very lacking. We've seen that we're at the halfway mark over the halfway mark for the 2030 goals, and we're still not made sufficient achievement or progress towards them. We also, have seen that, for example, the SDG index, which ranks how countries are doing in relation to the SDGs, has stalled over the recent years because of COVID as well. And then of course, everyone knows we're falling far short of our climate commitments under the Paris Agreement as well. And just recent reports from last week show us very much on track to pass the 1.5 degrees C threshold in just a few years. And so this raises some difficult questions. The first being, how can we address the climate crisis in a way that both enables us to limit temperature increase, but also enables sustainable development and allows us to do this in a more equitable way? How can we move away from the root causes of both climate change and inequality, which often have to do with unequal power dynamics or vested interests or economic growth? And how can we really make sure that the way that we move forward doesn't leave anyone behind and centers the needs and priorities of vulnerable and marginalized communities? So in our project, we really think about policy coherence as a potential lens for exploring some of these issues and for bringing together these different agendas to have kind of synergetic solutions in moving forward. So to define policy coherence, I think I would say that we've been working on this project since 2019, and we still don't really know what policy coherence is, but we broadly define it as a process of policymaking that systematically considers the pursuit of multiple policy goals in a coordinated way, minimizing trade-offs and maximizing synergies. So it really is about harnessing those synergies between different objectives and minimizing the trade-offs between them. The figure there is from the OECD, which has developed a framework of these building blocks of policy coherence, but they very much focus on kind of very technical aspects of policy coherence, such as the need for coordination or breaking down silos or engaging stakeholders involving different groups. So it's a very kind of technocratic and technical framing of policy coherence. In our project, we have tried to go beyond this to also look at kind of the political dimensions of policy coherence, particularly, what are the underlying ideologies or framings that might be enabling or limiting policy coherence? What are some of the, vested interests or power dynamics that are influencing policy coherence? So not just talking about, we just need different agencies to speak to each other and then all the problems will be solved, but also, getting down to the root causes of why coherence might not be happening. And this goes to this point, which is that in general, conflicts and trade-offs are framed in a very negative way, and policy coherence and coordination is framed in a more positive way, and that it is good to have whole of government approaches and joint of government. And that raises the question that if it's so rational and straightforward to have policy coherence, why isn't it happening? And what is at stake? So is it actually, necessary to have policy coherence in order to make progress on goals? Or are there ways to achieve goals without policy coherence, or even in context of policy incoherence, for example? So the relationship between policy coherence and goal achievement. And so as part of our project, which includes assessments at the global, national, and subnational level, we have these three kind of key questions. The first is around looking at the policy objectives themselves and the key synergies and trade-offs between climate, development, and inequality policies. So this involves an evaluation of policy content and looking at the interactions between policies themselves. And then in the policy process itself, we're looking at the key drivers and causes of policy coherence. And here we use this framework of the 3 I's called ideas, institutions, and interests. So what role do these factors play in influencing policy coherence? And then finally, we look at the consequences or the policy outcomes. So, is policy coherence necessary for goal achievement and for reducing inequality or not? And what is the relationship between policy coherence and achievement of goals? So I will stop there, and I think the case study presentation from Sri Lanka later on will delve more into these questions, and I will provide some examples from other countries as well. So thank you.